Welcome back to the afternoon session, and we are getting ready to begin. So if you can please get seated. And for those of you who are sitting all the way at the back of the room, would you please move up to the front a little bit closer so then we can have the conversation later, or you might want to ask questions. Okay, so the title for today's session is A Renewed Focus, Improving Outcomes for English Learners, and we are so honored to have the Assistant Deputy Secretary of Education and also the Director of the Office of the English Language Acquisition, Dr. Libia Gil, here to be with us at NABE today. So I would like to now invite her to come here to share the information, the latest information from the department. Welcome.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And I bring very warm greetings from what I call the heart of Washington, D.C., which is the U.S. Department of Education, and particular greetings on behalf of our Secretary, Arne Duncan. I have several reasons for being very happy to be here. Of course, first and foremost, I am very appreciative to be part of this community. The passion, the energy, the commitment to the common vision of serving our English learners is always very, very inspirational and makes me feel very, very warm. Obviously, everybody's talked about the weather, and yeah, you realize that where I come from in Washington, D.C. now, both airports were closed yesterday. So I made special arrangements to get out here early enough to bypass that closure. And of course, the third and final reason is this is coming home for me. My family is here in San Diego. It's really wonderful to reconnect with old friends and new colleagues, and of course, my family. So it's a little bit of a personal dimension I want to start with before I get into the agenda today. Just so you understand that I bring with me a very personal perspective to the work that I do, not unlike many of you in this room, and not unlike many of our children who are labeled English learners in our school system. Know that I'm a product of a multicultural, multilingual background. My mother happens to be from China, and my father is from Costa Rica. So coming to this country as a very young college student, I did have English language skills because I happened to learn English as my third language from Dominican sisters from Spain in the country of Taiwan. Now know that I started my formal education in Hong Kong when it was still a British colony, and I can give you stories about my British education as well. But I also spent many of my early growing years in San Jose, Costa Rica, so I do have family on both continents. But coming to this country, port of entry in Los Angeles Unified School, actually Los Angeles City, I did start my teaching in the Unified School District. But know that it was assumed that I was a native Californian. And because I had the language, I had absolutely no cultural reference. Who was Dick Clark? I did not grow up with television. In fact, I didn't even grow up with cars. We had pedicabs as our main transportation to and from school. And so I share this story only because there are so many myths about experiences and assumptions when we work with our English learners that I see perpetuated over and over again. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit as we proceed this afternoon. I would say that my personal story is classic. It's no different than many of yours, your family, your parents, or your great-grandparents, because coming to America was the dream. It was to pursue the American success dream. And there was no doubt from my parents' perspective, I didn't know this, my sister and I had no idea, that we would be expected to move to this country, uproot everything that they were comfortable with for the primary purpose of pursuing better education for improved life. So that was always fundamental that we grew up with. And at some point, I'm not sure when I became dominant in English, but my father was really clear that we had to learn English to be successful. So we ended up here. Being the eldest, I started, as I said, in college, Mount St. Mary's College in LA. And I would say that the only major significant nuance, different from most stories that I hear of our immigration stories and English learner story, is that as a freshman at the university and a college, I noticed that international students receive additional accommodations. For example, they were not penalized for not participating in classroom discussions. They got extra time to complete research papers or reports. Even though I knew the language, I didn't understand the expectations and the standards and the vocabulary. And it was literally a very shocking transition for me. So my first year here as a newcomer, I spent as much of my time and effort as possible to learn to speak English with an accent, which is a little different than most people who come here, because I wanted people to know that I was not from this culture, despite the fact that I could read and write and have so-called academic language. So keep this in mind if you hear some biases, because as I talk to you about the work that all of us are engaged in, obviously we all bring our own personal experiences, and there's very little boundaries from my experiences to what I see as current experiences that face many of our children in the school system. So this is just a quick visual. I kind of threw it together, and I do apologize because there's one section there that didn't quite show up, but know that that's the latest publication from the Santa Clara County Office of Education on global future and the value of multilingualism. And I share this slide as a little representation from a variety of sources that demonstrates the growing interest in English learners in this country. There's a national conversation capturing not only historical perspectives, but also practices, research, and policy concerns. So what I want to do this afternoon is very briefly, I hope, give an overview, a little bit of a review for, I think, most of you, but also get us together on a basic foundation of understanding from a national perspective, what does it look like right now for English learners? I'm going to go back to remind us about our historical context. And more importantly, let's talk about the issues, challenges, and then opportunities. I'll spend a little time about what we're currently doing at the department, specifically at the Office of English Language Learners. And I am looking to take advantage of this session with all of you to hear your thoughts. So on moving forward, I actually have questions for you. In addition, hopefully I'll get questions in return. But I would be really interested in getting the thoughts from this group and helping me prioritize the myriad of issues and concerns that we want to accomplish, kind of actions moving forward. And I'll be sharing some of those ideas with you. So who are the English language learners? How do we define them? And of course, we've been using synonymously EL or ELLs. And the definition in ESEA as authorized by NCLB is very specific about the age range. And essentially, it's also very broad that if kids don't have English as their primary language, or if they have difficulty with English language, that then denies their ability to be successful in the classroom. Those are all general definitions of English learners. The challenge here is that how each state actually operationalizes that definition is variable. So it is not uncommon to understand that a child who has been identified as an English learner in one state may or may not be classified as an English learner in another state. And to add to that complexity, yes, there's home language survey that everybody does, but they all vary. And assessments are different, and how students are placed are very, very different. And with states where there's a lot of local autonomy and discretion, it's very possible that even within a state context, you will have students that will change classification depending on where they go to school. So it is a national question and concern about how do we then think about making comparisons and getting a good profile of where our English language students are. So given that limitation of the definition I just shared, here's the most recent, what we call Consolidated State Performance Reports, CSPR, on where the largest enrollment of English learners are currently located as of the 2010-2011, which is the most recent report that we have validated. Keep in mind that these are numbers that come directly from state reports, so there may be some variations depending on the source, but the pattern remains pretty stable. This is the fastest growing population of students in our country, and as you can see, California actually leads the nation in the number of ELs enrolled in public schools. This particular visual shows growth. This is not where the highest concentration of ELs are. So it's a sharp contrast to the previous slide, because you'll notice that where the growth is highest is not in the states where I just showed you had the largest number of students. And what this picture reinforces is the notion that all states and all schools must be prepared to support English learners. They're not limited to only a few states. Not only is it the fastest growing, but you can see it's very geographically dispersed. And notice Colorado and also some of the southern states that we historically have not looked to as states with the highest percentages of ELs, but the growth is there. Coming back to California, since we're here, and it so happens to be the state with the largest number of English learners, here are the top 5 districts within California, and you heard this morning from San Diego Superintendent Cindy Martin. San Diego is the second largest district with 26%, and overall you can see the statewide total. And this is as of the last school year. Nationwide, the census has identified about 381 languages in our students speaking all of those languages in our public schools. But the ones that are the most frequently spoken, obviously first with Spanish and Vietnamese and Chinese, if you look over the last 5 or 10 years, seems to have switched positions, because for quite a while Chinese was the second in the place, and then Arabic and Hmong. Then back to California, you see that California students, EL students, actually mirror the national percentage and languages. Again, this is data that we collect from states annually, and this data is really based on school-age students currently enrolled in K through 12th grade. Spanish is approximately 80% of our EL students speak Spanish. So I included this slide to look at the projected Hispanic growth between 2015 and 2060. And as you can see, it almost doubles by 2060. And this has implications for our English learner population. I think it maybe drives the national profile. There is assumption or mythology that English learners are immigrants, whereas in fact, the majority of our English learners are born in this country. 57% of adolescents nationwide are US born. In fact, 27% are second generation, with 30% third generation. They do vary by regions, and most port of entry communities have many, many newcomers. Other facts that is part of the national profile is that a good majority of our English learners live in low-income households and have parents with disproportionately low school levels, as well as English learners also have a higher dropout rate. And you can see the comparison between immigrant students at 21% for dropout compared to 8% for native-born students. Another picture showing the sharp contrast on poverty level between ELs and non-EL students. Again, a very sharp contrast. So what happens to our students in terms of outcomes and achievement? I have just given you a very broad brush of data profile of our national picture, as well as a look at California. Our most recent NABE data between 2000 and 2011 shows, and if you read the columns, what you see is there's a California, I did pull out California deliberately, compared to national. So you want to read, there's two comparisons here. It's comparing EL students from one year to the next, but it's also comparing students to national profile. So let's take a look at the California grade 4 math. What you see is a increase in achievement data between 2000 and 2011 for California grade 4 math. But when you compare it to the national profile, it's a very similar profile because that column shows how California students, LEP students, or EL students compare with the national average. And if you go across the whole chart here, you will see where reading at 4th grade is, where math at 8th grade, math at the national level, as well as at the California level. And what this tells us over the 2 years, oops, didn't mean to go that fast. Both the national growth and California growth, with the exception of 4th grade math, California in particular exceeded the national average. What you see here is incremental growth within the English learner population, which is promising to know that at least we're not going backwards. But the next slide is what I want to emphasize, because despite this encouraging incremental growth from year to year with English learners, this is the most startling and disappointing summary of where we are, because we are now comparing English learners with non-English learners on national NABE results. As you can see, despite the growth, the achievement gap remains pretty wide. And I don't think any of us would say this is acceptable. Huge gaps persist. Our English learners continue to struggle academically across the country. So I do want to call out in particular a very vulnerable group, the long-term English learners, and these are students who have been defined as students who have been in our system at least 6 years, not making any progress in English proficiency nor academic achievement. So California Tomorrow, and actually Laurie Olson, did this 40-district study in California. And part of the key findings is that 59% of the secondary schools who are English learners are long-term ELs, and another way of phrasing that is LTEL. Another startling finding is that 50% of kindergartners have a very good chance of becoming long-term ELs. And there are multiple factors that contribute to this phenomena and situation. And one of them clearly is that few districts have any particular program or formal approaches to address this group of students. In fact, there's very little monitoring and there's very little recognition. Now, I call this out because it happens to be a very powerful study in California that first called people's attention that we even have this group of students. A very similar analysis of data in Texas found exactly the same pattern. We don't have a national study on this yet, but I would predict that we will see a movement around and questions about what do we do with this particular group of students, which is a subset of the larger population of English learners. And I think it's one of the most difficult challenges and one that we have to address, so I do call your attention to that in terms of a national picture. So before I consider other issues, I just want to pause a little bit and shift back to more of a historical and legal context for English learners, since that can inform how we think about issues for moving forward. There are several critical benchmarks in relationship to educating ELs that we don't pay enough attention to. And I'm going to go very quickly because I know many of you are familiar with these already, but I emphasize this because these are legal protections for ELs that we don't take advantage of or leverage enough. It seems that many of us, or some of our school districts, are either not aware of some of the protections, legal protections for English learners, or have ignored these. I don't need to explain the Civil Rights Act because that is about discrimination based on race, country of origins, etc. But let me note for you that ESEA in 1965 all the way to 1968, which was amended with the American Bilingual Education Act, was the very first national legislative action that dedicated funding and focus to support English language learners. And some of us are recipients of Title VII investments. Many, I know, people in this room were Title VII fellows, which meant that we got additional support to complete our graduate work with the intention of dedicating and committing ourselves to furthering the knowledge as well as the support for English learners. The most famous, I think, that most people are aware of is Lau versus Nichols. And that was a very strong outcome from a legal case by students in San Francisco, where the Supreme Court action actually supported back then the Office of Civil Rights position that you cannot deny students equal opportunity to an education based on language, in this case, English language gaps. So it's a very strong call for looking at not only language proficiency, but also academic success. And I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes because the Equal Education Opportunity Act is another one that says very clearly that we cannot overcome language barriers. And let me say, if an education agency fails to take appropriate action, language cannot impede the equal participation of students in all instructional programs. And finally, Castaneda is one that I absolutely appreciate because it was clarifying some of these early findings and very specifically defined that, most importantly, number one, that districts must look at theories of action for English learners based on good instructional theories and practices. The second, there's a three-pronged test. The second is make sure that if you're going to adopt a theory, that you really do implement it in alignment with that theory. But the third most important emphasis is that the outcome of students. And it's not good enough to demonstrate that students have acquired English language proficiency. They also have to demonstrate success academically. So if we really look at what we saw a few minutes ago in terms of a national profile, we've got a long ways to go to meet the expectation and the standards of this particular Fifth Circuit Court decision. And of course, ultimately, with No Child Left Behind, currently implementing Title III. Title III is specifically and exclusively designed to support English language learners. This is one we could spend days on, and this is, again, one that I really would love to hear from all of you in the audience. You know, what are those issues? What are the challenges that you're facing every day? And what opportunities do we have to really make a difference and alter non-productive practices to support our students? So I touched on assumptions and myths. And there's abundance of them. I mean, here's your, the favorite one I talked about already. Our ELs are all immigrants from other countries. And learning, whoops, I'm going backwards now. Sorry about that. Okay. Learning more than one language is very confusing, and it may even impede fluency in language development. And another one that's very common that we hear every day is good instruction is good instruction for everybody, including English learners. Or that all English learners learn English exactly the same way. And so we know that we have facts now and evidence and a growing body of very good research that refutes these assumptions, and we should seek every opportunity to expand the rigor of our research base to really establish what the facts are so that we can help diminish some of these assumptions that are made. Of course, our legal foundation that I just mentioned does protect both equity and access for English learners, and one of our most active office, the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education, is very much engaged in pursuing investigations, audits, and addressing complaints based on the legal perspective and parameters of what's happening in ELs. I don't know how many of you saw recently the settlement and agreement from in the Cleveland School District that came out a couple weeks ago. Here was a situation where there were some very rigorous STEM academy programs that happened to be located in some of the largest communities of almost all Latino students and families. And yet, we couldn't find a single child who happens to be Latino in any of the STEM programs. That's just one example. And so in negotiating with the district and talking to them about it, one of the results remedies is to ensure that all information is sent home in a language that's understood by the families. In this case, we're talking about translating opportunities because clearly there's evidence here that these students were completely excluded and denied access to rigorous STEM academy programs. So there's a number of issues like that that is very public, but know that there's ongoing investigations and ongoing efforts, and ideally, we want to work with the school districts and the community to ensure that, one, that they have the knowledge about the parameters, and two, that they do follow through. So there's a rigorous monitoring process that goes on. And I share this only because I don't think these are issues that are widely known, but our department is monitoring and vigorously pursuing concerns about the exclusion of English learners. And for those of us in this room, some of the issues we may think is egregious because we thought that happened maybe 20, 30 years ago, but not today in 2014. I'll just share another quick one because that's another public case. The Office of Civil Rights has a plan and a sanction with the Nashville School District, because 2 years ago that was and still in process of being a monitoring situation. But for decades, this is a district that has shuffled any ELs coming into that school district was literally bused to a separate building and a separate school. Part of the rationale, and it's understandable from that perspective, that because of limited capacity and limited resources, they were trying to concentrate all the staff and all the resources in one place to really adequately support the EL students who were coming in this case, mostly immigrants. But when you look at what the legal foundations are and how egregious it is to physically isolate any groups of students based on language and national origin, it is a violation of our very fundamental protection. So those are examples that if we don't pay attention, we still have practices that are not acceptable, and it's in clear violation of our legal parameters, and not everybody is thinking about that all the time. So this is one that I hope that all of you will help reinforce. We can spend days related to standards for language development and appropriate assessments in curriculum. I think most of you know that we have two consortiums, WIDA and ELBA 21, who is actually developing appropriate language assessments based on ELD standards. And they're working in parallel with PARC and Smarter Balance timeline because we know that it is significant and absolutely essential that we have reliable and valid measures to really consider and assess English proficiency for English learners. Now, I know there's a whole other challenge about native language instruction and what are the appropriate instruments. So that's another conversation, but know that that is recognized and we need to continue to pursue what does that mean when we are seeing the proliferation of dual language programs, for example, that are being implemented, and how do we best make appropriate assessments. There is no question that we are committed to the expectation that every child who leaves our system has English proficiency skills. I think the controversy and the tension is around the question of how best to get there. Do we really need to sacrifice our heritage language and culture to accomplish English acquisition skills? Thank you for that answer. So obviously, proliferation of dual language programs across the country, it's rare that I go through a week without getting 2 or 3 different examples of here's another school that is doing dual language. Casper, Wyoming is implementing Chinese and English, and the community and the parents are now demanding Spanish, which they are accommodating. I just got a few hours ago a wonderful email link that I have not gone into specifically, but the headline summary was a 15-year study from San Francisco Unified School District that indicated outcomes for students in a well-implemented dual language program far exceeds the outcomes for English-only students. So those are the kinds of evidence base that we need to continue to search for and support and invest in so that we can come up with strong basis for making the choices and the decisions that we make for our students. I mentioned earlier when you saw the map that the growth in English learners is geographically dispersed. And it is clear then, if we look at what the data is showing us and the prediction of where the growth is, we are now talking about the need for all teachers, not just those teachers that are identified bilingual educators, to be well prepared to serve our students. We are talking about leadership support as well, and there's opportunities to do that, and I will elaborate on that in a few minutes. Lots of things that could be on this list, and one, for example, that we don't pay enough attention to is about parent and family engagement. So you can imagine that there are lots more bullets under this large umbrella of what are the issues, what are the challenges, and where are the opportunities for us to really leverage, to alter, and accelerate the growth patterns for especially our English learner patterns. And again, I'm just kind of setting you up for what is to come. I really would love to hear from you. So what is the Department of Education doing? And I just pulled a few examples where we are familiar with some of these big initiatives that is millions of dollars of investments, and they actually do address English learners. I think part of the challenge is that we haven't done a good enough job of systematically gathering the findings and really answering the question, what have we learned? What have we learned about these investments that support English learners? So I mentioned Title III. Well, that's a $734 million investment. That's less than where it was a couple of years ago. So there's been fluctuations. But this particular category of funds is, again, exclusively to support English learners, and there's many ways to do that, which I'll mention in a few minutes. I3, which is investing in innovation, these are a multitude of grants, anywhere from several $100,000 to millions, depending on your proposal. But there's at least 24 grants that has been awarded, specifically addressing English learners that I think very few people know about. So one of the expectations that I have is that we're going to do a better job of identifying what those are and share them, because there's some valuable lessons to be learned that we are not disseminating very well. And the range of I3s, I can tell you, that goes from parent engagement and community engagement, particularly for ELs, all the way to curriculum testing for middle schools, and early learning studies, teacher preparation, both pre-service and in-service studies, all across the country. Some of these grantees are higher ed institutes, but others are nonprofit agencies, as well as school districts. So there's a multiple of variety of sources of information that we need to systematically gather and start looking at what is the pattern here and what can we learn so that we can look at improving our practices and outcomes for English learners. And the rest I'm just going to run through very quickly, because School Improvement Grant is a multi-billion-dollar effort, and as all of you know, designated schools with very chronic low-performing situations, what we call turnaround schools across the country in every state. But I wonder how many of you know that at least 37% of the kids in those schools are actually classified English learners. So the immediate question is, well, where are they? Who are they? What are the practices there? And most recent outcome of achievement data for the school turnaround in general indicated that maybe about 2/3 of these schools are showing some progress in achievement for students, but there's a third that is either making no progress or actually regressing. So the question I would pose, and it would be a hypothesis, is I wonder if there are a disproportionate number of ELs in that lower third category. And it would be good to look at that data. We have that data, and we're actually looking at that right now to try and answer that. But you can imagine all the other questions that would follow. So I'm sharing that as an example of the need to be very, very strategic and conscientious about asking those questions so that we can look at what the actual patterns are. We can look at what is working, what is not working. So if we have, for example, a large number of schools with very high population of English language learners, and they happen to fall in the top third category of strong performance, well, we might want to ask, what are they doing? As well as the lower third, what are they doing that we don't want to repeat? So there's so many different ways that we can actually capture current situations to leverage how we can work differently. Our adult English literacy, there's multiple grants that really focus on 16 to 21-year-olds. And of course, when we're talking about 16-year-olds, these are most likely English learners, could be long-term English learners who did not finish high school. And so now we find them in adult schools, evening schools, online recovery classes. Those are the kinds of support that the adult English literacy, even though it goes to adulthood, know that the definition starts at really adolescent when we're talking about 16-year-olds, so there's a real overlap with our students in K-12. There aren't a lot of promised neighborhoods, but the whole concept of promised neighborhoods is more of a holistic, integrated effort. It's the school district, it's the health components, is a cradle to college and career concept that involves multiple agencies within a given community and working closely together to align not only the health needs, the education needs, but also the economic needs of that particular neighborhood. It was modeled after a very successful Harlem effort, and there are multiple components in each of the proposals around promised neighborhoods that is very specifically focused on English language learners, not only the students, but also the families. So this is a very, very rich resource that we can also look at to tell us and inform us about what are some of the practices that seems to be making a difference in a very holistic way. So I can't finish this list without mentioning Race to the Top, because this is probably the most well-known and highly invested program across the country. The concern would be that these are only for a number of states who were competitively awarded major support, but not necessarily where all of the EL students are clustered. So for example, California is not part of this program. So there is the question of, what about the ELs in each of the states who did get awards, and where are they and what are they doing? Know that we are doing exactly that investigation, because when the states did turn in their proposal for statewide initiatives, embedded in there is a lot of discussion around ELs, but it wasn't specifically categorized as such. So our staff is actually combing through each of the 500 to 1,000 page proposals that they turned in to see if they actually addressed ELs and in what ways did they do it. And keeping in mind this is a statewide perspective rather than local districts. The local district, Race to the Top, just got implemented last year, so we don't have a lot of data on that yet. And finally, part of the Department of Education is the Office of English Language Acquisition, where I am currently located. It was authorized and funded through Title III categorical funds, and the main functions is to provide policy leadership. Few people know this, but we actually have a dedicated budget to invest in and support research priorities. And we have what is called the state formula grants, which is managed by the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. This is where the team really focuses on monitoring compliance, again, at the state level, because the state grants are then managed by the state, and they are driven by the number of students, so it's an entitlement allocation for each state. What we manage is called the discretionary grants, and these are grants that are focused on teacher preparation. We have a National Professional Development Grant and awards to higher education institutions, and primarily focus on pre-service, but also on in-service to help our higher ed institutes develop programs and support for English language learners through their teacher preparation certification process. We have two here in California, Southern California, actually in San Diego. You heard one was mentioned this morning at San Marcos, but there's another one at San Diego State University. So we are very, very eager to pull all of the findings. These are 5-year grants, by the way, and they do work in collaboration with local districts and other agencies like the County Office of Education, and we are very eager to pull all of the findings from each of these awardees and put it together in some kind of summary so that we can share it with all of you. Please know that we have dedicated funds and budget to addressing the language and cultural preservation for Native American and Alaska Native children, which would include, by the way, Hawaiian Native children in school program. It's interesting because it is specifically focused on not only preserving heritage language and culture, but also retrieving almost extinct languages, especially where tribal languages are primarily oral, and there's not a lot of documentation, and as elders leave, there's a real concern that we may be losing some critical languages with Native Americans. So there's a real strong focus on making sure that does not happen. We are at the tail end of what was called the Foreign Language Assistance Grants. Unfortunately, the last 2 years, Congress has not funded this particular program, although it certainly is part of our charge and authorization. So although we're not providing new grants, we do continue to support and monitor those existing grants that encourage what is called foreign language. I would prefer to call them world language or, heritage language, because certainly for our ELs, their languages are not foreign to them. So that's another story. Technical assistance, in fact, we have a representative from Ancela. Beatrice, you want to wave to everybody and say hello? Very excited because we have just awarded a contract to, and this is a 3-year arrangement with not only the Leads, which is a business group in DC that is the project lead, but we also have a partnership or a subcontractor, if you will, with CAL, the Center for Applied Linguistics, which is why Beatrice is here. And look to this website. This is available to everyone. for a new look. It is in transition right now, but we intend to put some of the findings I was suggesting that we want to learn from our grantees and do a lot more in disseminating and promoting effective practices. We will also have a lot more robust research that will support some of the practices. And this is the technical assistance function of our office, because we are responsible for making sure that we communicate with all of you and identify either model practices or best practices, both at the school level, at the district level, and also the state level. So moving forward, I'm mindful of the time. Let me very quickly say that these are questions that are foundational. How can we elevate English language learners, at the same time integrate the discussion with systemic initiatives? And I'm talking about all the work that not only each of you are doing in your respective districts and systems. We're constantly thinking of how can we improve outcomes for all of our students, but in particular with English learners, there tends to be a very fragmented approach. It's always this event or that event, but let's not forget the ELs. Let's consider how we can make sure that we are proactive and be more systematic and strategic in addressing the inclusion of ELs from the very beginning, whatever the initiative is, whether it's talking about, Common Core implementation or talking about higher ed access. Let's think about implications for English learners. And of course, with appropriate information, what kind of supports are we looking at? What do we need to ensure successful outcomes? And how do we strengthen biliteracy and multiliteracy goals? These were just a couple of basic questions, almost simplistic, but has complex implications. And there's a laundry list of questions, but I thought I'd throw this out as a starter for people to think about and help us prioritize. I know we're not going to have time because I was hoping we could actually engage in answering some of those questions, but I wanted to leave you with a few thoughts that are starting thoughts. Again, talking about knowledge management is one of the key priorities that not only we can do, but we can do collectively. I am sharing some thoughts that we can do as a collective group and also individually that would really help us move forward with strengthening our support for English learners. I'm not going to read all this to you, but I do want to point out that under collaboration and communication, being very, very mindful and modeling strength-based languages when we describe our English learners. Yes, there's reasons for us to build a case to get more attention and more resources, so we do have the facts, high dropout rates, unacceptable academic performance, but at the same time we need to balance it with the language that focuses on our students come to us with rich resources and assets to contribute. And that is so important because inevitably when we don't think that way or talk that way, we are actually contributing to lower expectations and lowering our standards. So you can see family engagement. We want to convene some national voices so that we have a unity of purpose and a unity of a voice that says this is a very, very important topic for all of us to be paying attention to. So I bring you concluding words from Arne Duncan. And I'm not going to read this all to you, but what I will emphasize, quote, "And today, more than ever, a world-class education requires students to be able to speak and read languages in addition to English." Now, he starts by saying both the president and I do have some of the quotes from the president as well. But in this particular quote, Arne does emphasize the role of the department in promoting more than one language from early learning all the way through high school.
I am the global future.
I am the global future.
I am the global future.
Soy el futuro de la sociedad global.
Je suis le futur mondial.
मैं पूरी दुनिया दी भविख हां. I am the global future.
In the 21st century, bilingualism and multilingualism are essential to the global competence of our students. The ability of students to understand and adapt to a rapidly changing world will set the tone for their future success. Students that possess bilingual skills and mastery of multiple languages will thrive as they navigate this dynamic global economy, explore other cultures, and communicate their own ideas to the world.
Students who are bilingual and bicultural, the County Office of Education believes, have significant advantages in the new millennium. These advantages are economic, they're social, they're communicative. With emerging and accelerated changes in technology and real-time communication globally, individuals who are bilingual and biliterate can reach out and speak with people all around the world, share ideas, discuss issues and topics, and we believe at the County Office of Education that our public education system has an obligation to promote bilingualism and biliteracy.
We're educating students for jobs that don't even exist right now. We continue to see the dialogue around STEM or STEAM, right? And we need students and graduates who understand science and engineering and math. But unless you can articulate that, right, with strong communication skills, not only in your own language, but in a second or a third language, people need to communicate and talk and have critical thinking skills.
Being bilingual right now could help me in my future career because I want to be a dentist when I grow up, and it's easier for me to have a bilingual job so that I could be able to communicate with my patients in both English and Spanish.
My goal is learn 5 or more languages. I like to speak, I speak English and Spanish. I like to speak Italian, French, Vietnamese, Japanese, Chinese. I wish I could speak a lot of languages. I really enjoy that.
Since I know English, Mandarin, and Cantonese, and I'm studying Spanish currently, it'll be much easier for me to travel to other countries and communicate with the people there if I have a job that requires me to go overseas.
Learning another language is like learning another subject. There is no limit to what your knowledge can give you.
I feel like when you stay in one place your whole life, you just kind of know that corner of the world, but when you get to learn a different language, you also learn the culture that comes along with it, and so you really, I don't know, I feel like it just opens your eyes and changes the way that you see things.
So thank you to the Santa Clara County Office of Education. This is an example of reasons to be extremely optimistic. We have a window of time here to forge a united coalition of voices that will support and help make the dreams come true for each of the students, and each of these students represent obviously thousands of other students. So I thank each of you for being part of this effort, and I do apologize that we didn't have time to interact, but note my email address there. Feel free to send me a note. Love to get your suggestions. Help me prioritize. There's so much to do. We'd like to really think about what are the key few things that we could do that will make extraordinarily difference, because we can do a lot of little things, but are there some particular high leverage activities or initiatives that we can take? And again, I think you are the people who are sitting closest to students every day, and I want to make sure that your voices are heard and that we can be responsive and really make a difference collectively to support our students. So thank you all very much for joining this afternoon.